Today on the Social Studies Show, we have Toby Kaufmann, the Creative Director of the Facebook app. She is also the Creative Director of Pursuit, a digital archive and deck of playing cards, reimagining Catherine Opie's seminal work from the 1990s, in collaboration with artist Naima Green. In 2020, she curated a show of Naima's work at Fotografiska in New York City. Before she moved west for Facebook, Toby was the Executive Director of Photography for Refinery 29, where she led the brand's photographic vision and expanded video storytelling. She also served as Vice President of the Society of Publication Designers and co-chaired SPD Gala 53. She consults for Parsons, the new school for design, and her work has been recognized by the Webby Awards, American Photography, Photo District News, American Society of Magazine Editors, and SPD. Toby also has a BFA in photography from Parsons. First off, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a work in progress because you are harder to track down than like dog bounty hunter.
Thanks for having me. Yes, these are not, I think we've had a lot of conversations about like why you do this, and I really respect that you do it. So it's not always my favorite thing talking about myself, or my career, but I'm here now, so let's do it.
Okay, well, one of the first things that I kind of watched on another show to get some insight on you, and is the fact of like your family upbringing. Like you decided from jump, right, that you wanted to be creative. You didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer, and so if you could tell me a little bit about like your family history and like what made you, what was a driving force for you to be like, I want to be a creative?
Yeah, so I grew up in Soho in the 80s in New York City, and with two parents that had non-traditional jobs. My dad started one of the first flea markets in New York City, and my mom was an actress and a singer, and my dad was also an artist. And I think just growing up without parents like going to work every day and growing up in a loft and growing up with just you're just kind of in that zone. Like I didn't experience suburbs until I was around 18 years old. So I think that was just my normal, right? So that I saw these creative people and it just like really sparked that interest in me. And I don't think I saw of course my parents had friends that were like doctors and lawyers and like regular jobs, let's call them.
Yeah.
But I think for the most part, it was filled a lot more with more creative humans, visually creative humans.
So a question with that, like, and like when you're running the streets, it's funny because like, Soho in the 80s is a very different Soho than now.
Yeah.
Like, what was your friend group like? Like, what was that like as a teenager?
Yeah.
Because my friend, like this friend of mine, David Schechter, he lives in Soho still now. And like, I'll be talking to him, he's like, oh yeah, like, I used to hang out with Cause. And like, Cause is one of his good friends, and like, he knows these things. So it's like, there was this like weird epicenter of really creative people that came out at the time. So like, what was your group like?
Yeah. So in high school, I went to high school actually in Northern California in like a very rare, very, very remote part where I think my graduating class had like 80 people or something like that. It was really
Okay.
tiny. But I would go back kind of like for summers and go visit New York and spend time there. And I think it was actually really good for me because a lot of like my middle school and elementary school friends got into not such positive things, I would say, because
Okay.
everything is so accessible to you, right?
Yeah.
Growing up in New York, especially in the 80s. And I kind of always reference the movie Kids, which is
Mhm.
an extremely dark movie, but in some ways that was kind of the way I remember my childhood, which is you have a huge amount of freedom because the expectation is that you're taking yourself to school. And in this case, my older sister and I would go from Soho into the West Village for school, and we'd take the subway and whatever. But we had a lot of freedom, right? There was a tremendous amount of freedom. So I think that I actually gravitated a lot more towards my Californian friends because they seem to be more stable, I
Mhm.
guess. There was a lot less drug use, there was a lot less sex, there was a lot less just like irresponsibleness around them. And
Mhm.
so at some point I kind of moved more towards like focusing on them rather than focusing on my New York friends. And in that respect, my siblings, because I have so many of them, really became the people that I would hang out with when I'm in New York, right? I have two older sisters and a younger sister and a younger brother. So there's a lot of us kind of running around. And then, my dad having the flea market kind of had wrangled this crew of BMX boys from like the Lower East Side and from Soho that like worked on the weekend. So we would hang out with them. And so it was kind of this like, it became like a different set of kids than you may have gone to like middle school or elementary school or high school with. It's kind of like this other pact of humans.
So when you're doing that and you're looking at this creative world and you're having these different influences, what is the thing that made you lock in on the creative world? And like, I know you went to school and you went to Parsons and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
how did you obviously that's a lot of distraction.
Right. A lot
So
of distraction.
how did you come into that singularity of focus?
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of girls, it was like, I'm into my photography phase in my teenage, early teenage period. That was like a very, very common thing back then, I would say, common trope. And then my sister, I lived with my older sister when I was around 16 for a summer, and I went to the SVA summer program. And that really, it was a good introduction into the rigor of what formal training would be around photography.
Mm-hmm.
And, I thought I wanted to be a documentary street photographer. Like that was what was in my brain, like Ouija and kind of things like that. And I think luckily I just was very myopic in what I wanted to do. And so I graduated from high school when I was 17, moved back in with my older sister, and then took a year off actually from high school, between high school and college, to make money because I was paying for college entirely on my own. And I needed to, well, number one, I wanted to kind of gut check, like, is this right? Before I went in. And that was like a very clarifying year for me because I was like desperate to get back to school. And I think there was a few reasons for that. Number one, the job I got between that year was working at the commodities exchange in New York City. So I was like the youngest woman on the commodities trading floor. So imagine like, you see movies from the 90s.
Wall Street. Yeah.
Exactly. Like it was that like pressure filled. It was that insane. But I was like also 17 years old. So it was pretty intense. But I also fell in with a group of artists at the time that I met like really just like kind of on the street, like randomly. And those artists were all going to Cooper Union. And they really kind of kept me alive in that first year in terms of like discussions about art, discussion about artists, discussion of like what's happening. So it was like, it really was two sides of the world, which is like being able to like really get clarity that I didn't want like just a not normal 9-to-5 job and that I actually did have a passion. And then also having that passion fueled by this community of artists that I like totally randomly found.
That's amazing. Because I mean, like, again, in that time in New York, there's so many different distractions. So,
Right.
One thing, just because you've worked through so many different mediums as far as like print and digital, I really wanted to see and get your mindset of how you see imagery as a way of communication, like how you use imagery as a broad-based tool to talk with the masses, especially now working with the Facebook app.
Right. That's a big question. I mean, we could talk about that for a long time.
We only have 40 minutes.
I think photography specifically, and we can talk about that, is really strong because you're able to see yourself in it. Literally, you're able to see yourself in it. And it is a literal representation of humanity. And I think the pivots that we've seen in the last decade have been really nice because, for me growing up, the standard of beauty was, of course, a blonde woman with blue eyes and very Western features. And now the expansion of beauty and what that is, while I do believe we're kind of backsliding significantly right now, I think we've made a huge amount of progress in the last 10 years. So I think that like visual representation of humans is it's said a lot, but it can't be diminished how important it is to be able to literally see yourself in whether that's product of Facebook or ad campaigns or Target or, you know, an editorial, like whatever that is, but that representation of like, oh, I look like that, right? Especially for younger humans, it's huge.
Well, I think the one thing that's like that's really interesting and working in a social media app right now, and something people have talked about is like you get consumer feedback, right? You can read in the comments, you can see the analytics, and you can see what people care about and resonate with and what they don't, right? So how much does that play into your job currently?
Yeah, I mean, that's not a new thing. I think I think maybe reframing that slightly is like, you know, in print magazines, we would also get that, right?
Mm,
Like there was definitely like data testing
mm,
back then. And you definitely would get numbers even back then. And
okay.
then when I moved to Refinery, there's certainly that as well, in that any digital media has comments, right? And analytics based on traffic, right? And SEO terms, things like that. So I think this is nothing new, is like handling metrics. I think it's just that it's probably more amplified because it's a larger pool of humans. And I think like my design ethos is like, yes, it's very important to understand like what people are gravitating towards, but I
Mhm.
actually feel like a designer's job is to give people something that they don't know they wanted, right? To really surprise people. Because
Okay.
if you describe things, like let's say you were to describe a painting to someone, they're like, oh, that painting sounds boring. And then
Mm,
you show them the Mona Lisa, and they're like, actually, this is a critical piece of art history. It shifts context, right? So I think it's certainly important to understand how analytics are used and comments and all of those things. But I think also at the same time, it's important to think about as a designer what we believe is best and
okay.
what the world is evolving to, right?
Okay. So that brings me to my next question. How do you go about facilitating empowerment and advertising? Not necessarily just in your current job, but the place that I really saw it was when you really kind of stepped to the leadership of Refinery 29 and just how that kind of changed, and just it's really seemed to capture such a different cross section. And like I think when you like live in New York, you see that cross section.
Yeah.
But when you're looking at the magazines and some of the editorials and some of the stuff like that, you didn't see these people. It was almost kind of like they were just kind of like ghosts kind of wandering in this thing, but you really brought these people to the forefront. So, and I think like not necessarily even just in the creative, but in the people that you're hiring too.
Yeah.
So I think that if you could kind of elaborate a little bit how you went through that process, or what your process is, and how you try and do that, and like not just champion those people, but also get the best out of them and maybe see something that they don't see in themselves. Because I mean, obviously, when you're a new creative and diverse in that field, you deal with a lot of imposter syndrome. You're kind of like,
Yeah.
can I do this? So that's a lot of big questions too.
The
So
secret is not just when you're a new creative. Like I have tremendous amount of self-doubt in the work that I do all the time. I don't think it goes away at any point. I think it's just something that um unfortunately you have to develop coping mechanisms around. So that's like one thing to address. I think for people to understand sooner rather than later is like, you don't get to the top. You don't get, okay, Toby Kaufmann, you're now creative director of this thing. Now you're going to feel all your self-doubt you've ever experienced is like going to diminish. That's not what happens, right? So I think that's important to recognize, like that like questioning of like, is this right? Am I doing this right? Am I good enough? It's a I think, at least for me, it's like an ongoing struggle. So I think acknowledging that is important. On the side of, you know, really how we evolved for Finery was, I think it was a confluence of like kind of perfect timing. You know, there were a lot of lead editors that were very interested in changing that conversation. And I think we had a lot of initiatives that were starting to kind of sprout. So for example, a 67% project, which started around the same time that I started, which was, the commitment, at least for while I was there, which is that 67% of the idea was 67% of women in the US are size 14 and above. And so we should be representing them appropriately within our editorial, our branded content. And so that really unlocked that ability to go after that and to actually have some measurable spaces. And at the time, luckily, I had someone on my team named Lilac Perez, who's now a casting director, and she has her own business, but she had casting experience. And a great eye. And an interest to do this.
Yeah.
So it was like, how do we strategize with this human how do we unlock her to be able to like go after the people to tell stories that are not just the blonde hair, blue-eyed models, right? And I think we had like a lot of leadership, high-level leadership backing, which made it a lot easier. But then it was like, tactically, it was like Lilac pounding the pavement on the subway, meeting people, talking to people, like just going out into the world. You said New York is such a diverse place, and that was literally the casting ground, right? And then I think we started to see feedback, which is I'm seeing myself in the content, and that is impacting me in a huge way, right? Like you're the first people that when you mention plus size, you're not talking about a size 10, you're actually talking about a size 16, a size 18, a size 32, and actually showing it in the representation. So I think that was like the really early seeds of that. And I think it happened a lot more organically than maybe it looked like a super crazy strategy, which I think it was loosely, but I think we couldn't have anticipated how much it would really change culture. Because at that time, it was still in the zone of, get your beach body in 5 weeks and drop 1,000 pounds in 5 seconds sort of vibe.
Well, I think here's the funny thing about that, and something that I'm curious about, right? When all of a sudden you go there, all of a sudden you're unlocking all these stories that maybe people haven't heard or that. So I was just wondering if there was any kind of like quintessential example of just like some amazing stories that you heard from these people and from the different plus sizes, or how they go about like shopping and coming to the products, and that you were able to like glean these insights and actually empower them in that way, and just be like, oh, I get to actually tell my story and share my perspective.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's number one, it's the rise of plus size women in fashion, right? Like we can see it kind of all around us now. But I think not just as humans, as models representing, but as like brand ambassadors, as designers. And I think, the hypothesis and the truth of it, which is that 67% of women are size 14 or above, is a huge financial gap, right? If you're not serving women from a fashion perspective, then you're leaving money on the table. So I think designers started to see, actually, there's a lot of, it's the right thing to do, number one, but it's also like there's a lot of money on the table to be made around this.
That's something I really kind of bring about DEI, as far as like respecting your consumer, as far as that goes, when you come to looking at marketing like to diverse communities, because they spend a lot of money. And I think people kind of see it as this like charity option, where I think it's people that's like, I mean, like maybe some of those size 14 women, they see all these like designs and couture and things that they actually want to wear, but no one actually ever made it for them, so they can't actually spend the money because they love the look.
Deeper than that, it's like, it's not even couture necessarily, it's like Zara, right?
Yeah, no,
like
for sure.
Like Gap, like it's like, so now when you look at ad campaigns like Old Navy, and certainly they've been serving the plus community for a lot longer than a lot of brands, but like there's always huge plus representation in the work that they're doing. So I think I think the legacy of the work that we did, I was at Refinery for almost 4 years, and the legacy that we had, you can still see it reverberate, and not only through representation of models, but stories and expectations around crew, right? Like we started primarily hiring women as photographers, and that seems like a no-brainer at the time because Refinery is a women's led brand, but that wasn't necessarily what was happening when I initially started, right?
No, I mean, there's like a lot of gatekeeping as far as that goes in production. And it's
Right.
also how they see like this was a male role versus a female role. And like, it's really interesting in the crews that I put together because there's so many interesting people that I come across. And like I said, I was just talking to you about a makeup artist I use them mainly for DEI, but she comes up with all this creative stuff, and like some of the latest projects we've just done, kind of like more Afrocentric, Afrofuturistic kind of things like that. She had these ideas as a makeup artist and would do, but as a Black woman, she literally came to me and was like, I can't find any photographer to shoot these test shoots of ideas. And I was like, I'll do it. Like, I'm not. And she was just like, she was so surprised, like just like the enthusiasm on her face of being like, wow, you actually will help me fulfill my idea.
Right.
So I can continue.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was like kind of I always kind of call that job like the job love of my life. Like there was so much opportunity to literally, we had a franchise called Take Back the Beach, which was all about like not being body shamed when you go to the beach. My team and I created a series around like what it was like to be trans at the beach, because that's not always a safe space for trans people to be able, right, to enjoy. So I think there was just a tremendous amount of freedom that we were able to, like, if we could come up with the idea, sell the idea, and then, execute it, we could do it. And that is really cool. I met, I was just recently talking to my kid who's 10 about someone I found on Instagram. I met on Instagram back then, named Desmond is Amazing, was at that time a 10-year-old drag queen. And totally instantly fell in love with him. He's such an amazing human. And I was like, I love what you're doing. It's so unique. Let's make a fashion video, right, with you. And so, going to the editors and being like, I found this kid. I think he's really unique. He's really special. His mom's really cool. Like, let's get it. And everyone was like immediately on board. So I think there was like a real strong brain trust there of like everyone kind of driving towards the same goals, which is not easy in any world, right?
Well, I think that's something that I kind of wanted to touch on, and it's funny because I was actually talking to one of the creatives just recently that we've interacted, and I think right now it's a really interesting thing of how, after post George Floyd, people were like, okay, let's hire a bunch of different Black photographers, and people were looking for a bunch of young, kind of new, upcoming talent, kind of things like that, right? And it's funny because like I'm older, and it's funny because things that were coming my way is like people were like, hey, do you want to go cover the riots? Do you want to cover the riots? Do you want to cover the riots? And I'm like, I'm a studio trained photographer. So it's like an interesting thing of like where they wanted to put you as far as scale things go. And like also in the fact of the matter is like something I look at in empowering and DEI, and especially with leadership, right? It's like, okay, well, we get to this level, right? And you bring all the emerging artists in, but you still have to kind of go to leadership and C-suite executive level and like founders and companies, as far as like going and doing leadership across the brands for companies abroad, right? And so that's where you start seeing kind of like these little bit of roadblocks, right? Because it's a harder thing, because when you're talking about convincing ideas, and I mean, if you're a straight white cis male and like pretty much you've been told your whole life that whatever you do is going to be perfect, and then you have a Black male or a trans woman or a trans non-binary or like woman telling you like, here's what we need to do, right? It's that thing of like all of a sudden like they're not the expert anymore, and so there's like that point where sometimes people come defensive. And so that's the interesting thing of like having to try and like get those ideas across. But like, sometimes it's not even like the marketing people you have to get to, it's the finance people, right?
Yeah.
Because the finance people don't want to actually pay for the marketing thing to go and pursue this diverse idea, because the financial holder. And so like, if you're talking to an accountant who's a finance thing and it's a white male, he might not see the vision of what the marketing is trying to do here in like the long game. And
Yeah.
so those are some of the hiccups and things that I've seen as of working more in more leadership scale, of like, how do you get around that, and like trying to figure that out and actually get these people to realize like what you said earlier, right? There's a lot of consumers here that actually you're neglecting, that you could actually go and make money off of, and include if you do it this way, but they're not seeing those people and not
Right.
seeing that audience. So that's something I really love to hear your opinion on.
I mean, one thing that I've learned in my life, and regardless of wherever I've worked, and also in my personal life, is that it's very hard for people to learn lessons unless they're personally affected or experience things. And I think one thing that, I talk a lot about DEI internally within Meta. And one thing I always say, well, two things I always say is that number one, when you think about all of this, you need to put yourself in the back seat. And I think people are not great at that, right? So it's like, what is this project? It's like, it's actually not about me, right? And so like putting yourself not first, and what you think immediately not first, hearing from everybody and moving forward from that is critical. I don't think that that necessarily happens all the time.
So is there a way that we could go and work about teaching that? Is there like, because like, I see DEI course, but it's like, and people are taking them and stuff, but it's like, it's really like a hard thing to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Like, and we talk about like economic backgrounds or gender issues, or like, I don't even know, just like
Yeah.
regional areas, right? So it takes a lot of listening, just really kind of not
There's no
being,
switch, right? There's no book, there's no
yeah.
course. It's like, I think, I never claim to be an expert, right? Like I'm not an expert in this space.
Mhm.
I just have worked on this for a bit of time. And
Mhm.
I think that that's all you can ask other people to do, which is work on it and listen to people. And it doesn't mean you need to agree with them. Like that's the other thing. It's like, just because like you're not asked to like completely change your mind immediately about something, but
Mhm.
over time, it's also exposure to different humans and different points of view, and like craving that, I think is important. And it's really cliche, and I'm just going to say it, but it's like doing the work, right? It's like reading the books, listening to the
Mhm.
podcasts, like fundamentally understanding that your POV is very unique to you, and that other people's POV also, you need to understand to some level what other people are going through, or went through growing up, or whatever their things are. You need to try to see it from their perspective. And I think that you teach that by teaching curiosity and teaching
Mhm.
empathy. um
Well, I think
and
that's a
the
really
other
thing.
thing I would say that I
Yeah.
always say people to
Okay.
tell people um is that it's not Black and brown people's responsibility to teach white people about DEI. It just fundamentally is not.
Mhm.
Um, it's up to white people to do that work and to be
Well, the same thing with gender issues too. And I think that's,
totally.
a certain thing of like, and I think something that's interesting in that, before you can create these advertising and marketing initiatives like that, is like creating a safe space for people to give feedback within the company,
Yep.
because that's a huge thing where it's like, people, like I've been at those tables where I'm like the only Black person, and it is
Yep.
fearful to actually go and put like, here's what I think we need to do, because you fear retaliation or that.
Yep.
Like, I literally have been, fired from a job because of giving actual real feedback, and people were like, you just don't really like that, so
Right.
you're gone, and
Yeah.
like, if you haven't gone through that, you don't really like
Yep.
understand, because now people are like, hey, we'll speak up now, and you're like, feel safe, it looks
Yeah.
safe. I don't know if it's safe.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, I see that in the work that I've done in my entire career. That definitely is valid and it definitely exists. And like, I don't know how to make it better because I go through it myself, right? Like, I definitely been discriminated based on my gender, my career, and it sucks and it feels like shit. And there's no magic bullet to fix it, unfortunately, except that you need to keep going at it, finding
So,
ways to like kind of be creative to keep pushing at it, because again, people only learn based on their experiences, right?
so what drives you to keep going? What's that inner spark that kind of like, what's that, like that feeling? Because it's like, I know it's hard. So like, 'cause I know it for myself, right?
Right.
It's like, but I mean, I'd like to hear your version.
I mean, because I don't know. Um, I mean, I think it's important, and I look around now and I'm like, oh wow, okay, I've been doing this for a long time and I've learned a few things and decently respected within the community. And it's like, my job is to, I see my job to like grow my influence through bringing other people up as well, and giving people opportunities that maybe they wouldn't have historically, because they don't have exactly the type of experience that is requested, or they, yeah, I mean, I think it's just giving people opportunities. And I think sometimes that's a risk and people don't like to take risks. But at the same time, it's like you can't always be hiring the exact type of person exactly like over and over and over again. It's like that's boring, number one. That doesn't push the creative work forward. And it doesn't help speak to new audiences, right? And that's true for any work, like whether I'm here at Meta or Refinery or any of the places I've worked, right?
Well, I think my new favorite thing now is when I'm hiring people or when I come across new people is finding people whose skill set is completely wildly outside of mine. Because
Yeah.
what it does is just, it's like the sum of things coming together makes everything better. And so it's
Right.
interesting to kind of look at it. It's like, I hate to sound weird, but it's kind of like Voltron. You
Yeah.
know, everything kind of comes together to make this like, amazing thing. But I'm like looking for people who have strengths outside of like what I do, or know something that I don't know,
Right.
or can think of that and like get me to think of something. And it's kind of like sometimes hearing their thing helps me almost sharpen the tip of the spear with my knowledge of what it experienced that way. But I had never even thought about it from that perspective or that way of kind of like coming at things. And so it almost reinvigorates me. It almost brings back, it's like, I mean, I hate to sound like weird, but it's kind of like a fountain of youth of kind of like of this
Yeah.
curiosity and ideas and things flowing where you've kind of just been like, your ways,
Right.
right? So all of a sudden the people are coming at you and they're interjecting and they make you kind of like revitalized.
Yeah. I mean, the curiosity part is something that I always look for. It's like what are people, what are they interested in looking at? What are the things that they want to talk about? And a lot of people have the same kind of skill set that I might be looking for, but like, maybe someone's really into like a specific genre of photography that I don't know that much about, or an area of the world of photography that's really thriving that I also don't know anything about. And so I want, to your point, the like fountain of youth, right? It's like it's cool to see what people are looking at, and it makes you a stronger creative by continuously, understanding like what's happening in the world, because you can't know everything, right? That's a really important lesson. You shouldn't need to. And like I want to have conversations with people that don't necessarily agree with me, right? Like that's sharp. Talk about sharpening your crayons. It's like, how do you describe your POV if you're never challenged, right? Like how do you like continue to ideate on it if you're never like challenged or questioned or any of that, which is something that we should be doing more as a creative community.
So here's an interesting perspective, because I think, what was the shift? Because you worked on all these different men's magazines. You worked on GQ, you worked on Maxim, you worked on Men's Fitness. And obviously there's like a distinct shift where you like go to Refinery 29. what were some of the things that were like interesting comparisons, or what are the things maybe you learned from the men's magazines that you wanted to change over here with Refinery 29? And like, do you still like do those groups that you kind of like work with at both magazines, do you still interact with some of that stuff? Have you kind of moved on? Do you have kind of like a different kind of like
Yeah.
insight with stuff?
I mean, I think that something that's interesting that people might not know that's a through line is that I've really always looked to hire women in terms of photographers. And before that was like a thing, at Maxim, there was a lot of women that we were working with, men's fitness, really everywhere. Because what came out of my early experiences, which was I was very sensitive to the dynamic of male creative director, female photo director, and male photographer. And so interesting to kind of like, number one, shift perspectives, right? Like different person showing up, different perspective. And then also shift the power dynamics on set, right? And
That's
so
a big one.
that's a big one. And I just didn't, it felt very like, it can feel very Austin Powers, back then in the early aughts. It's like when I was, I graduated in 2002, and it's like, it was very, similar. It's like male creative director, male photographer, and female photo director. The female photo director often didn't have that much of a voice in those spaces. So I think that's a through line, is that I've consistently worked with women my entire career. And I think that really is the main through line. And whatever kind of work I've always been doing, I've always been thinking about like gender dynamics at the workplace.
Okay. No, it's interesting because I think it's something that, going back to the executive level of that, it's really interesting to see men who have worked for women versus men who haven't worked for women, and it's a different dynamic. And like, I have a very strong mother and a very strong sister, as far as my sister was the one who actually like got me into journalism. And then I worked for women, like I worked with Mary Ellen Matthews and I worked for Annie, and it's like, and it's a different thing when you're like, you screwing up gets you fired, right? And so it's a funny thing. I think that's something too when we're talking about DEI. You don't see a lot of people who have had to answer to a Black or an Asian or a woman boss, and I think that kind of changes the dynamic, because all of a sudden it's put its perspective of like, my performance is being evaluated on this level by this person, so like, I need to understand them so I understand how to perform in that way. So,
and something I've noticed is that oftentimes women, and in terms of the bosses that I've worked with, have had to work harder, right? Same in terms of the Black community. I know that, like, it's not an uncommon thing where it's like, so if people are measured at a different level, it's often because the women are performing at a much higher level, that just to be at the same kind of parity as men have been.
with, honestly, like, a harder judging scale, like that's the hard thing, of hardship of even just like thinking about like something that's come to me is just like being a mother and like having childcare and daycare and like trying to manage that with a successful career. Like, I mean, a lot of people, like friends of mine, have even moved away from LA because they can't even afford childcare to work here, right?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting dynamic. Or people have just like stopped their jobs, they take time off to like be able to raise their children and things like that. And so that's a different dynamic that like sometimes I don't think necessarily like male figures think, where I don't know, I kid with my girlfriend all the time that I'm happy to be a house husband and do like weird photo projects, because like sometimes like the photography world has gotten like crazy competitive and really like very fast paced and very quick. And like I said, and so I think it's something that you were kind of talking about like in one of your podcasts, like you wake up every day and like you're working your ass off, right? And like, I feel the same way like here. And I think sometimes people think to get a certain level and like people don't wake up with that same enthusiasm and drive every day, where like I literally have to, like it's just something where like it's inherent. I think that's again, getting back to like that drive of like why you do this. And my personal reason is like, okay, well, like I'm this person who's creative, like I'm actually looking to create and make a better world and like something to be left behind as far as like legacy for my friends and family and like kids and whatever. So I mean, that's kind of a side tangent, but
No, I think it's important. And I think like, for me, I also look at older women in this
Mhm,
business, and
mhm,
there's at some point they become irrelevant, kind of age out of the industry.
mhm,
And so it's something that I think about a lot, which is like remaining relevant, not only for myself in terms of like, I need a job, I need to pay my bills, but also like to establish that bar of excellence that
mhm,
is an expectation to have older female leaders
mhm.
in the creative field, because I look around again and there are not that many that are that I know of, right?
No, it's funny because I just did this job recently, and the producer, Connie Conway, she's an older woman. She's been around. She's like thing, but like she was such a phenomenal producer and like a wealth of information. And I literally like I was like, the best thing about this job was meeting you. Like, like because and it was just it's funny when she's was able to be like, okay, I'm totally looking to help DI community, diversity, kind of help you guys understand kind of things, how production goes. And so she was just really helpful, like, and like thinking for younger people on the crew to be able to like listen and learn from her. And it wasn't like it was like she wasn't above it. She wasn't things. She was just like, she had questions and like we'd give her different things. And she's like, okay, I hadn't thought about this, but here's how to go about this, that, this, like problem solve that way. And she was just amazing. Like, I mean, shouts out to Connie.
Shout out to Connie.
She killed it, right? One thing, another question I have for you is like, what were some of your meaningful projects for at Refinery 29? Because I really love the all woman project that you guys did. It was like, it was great copy and amazing voiceover. Like I was like listening to it and like, I had a radio show in college, so I love voiceover. So I'm always like listening to things, and I was like, wow, this is phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, that was an amazing project. All Women Project came through a model, Clem. Oh, she's French, and I'm gonna mess up her last name. Devereaux, I believe.
Hmm, that sounds very French
Right,
and
Clem.
amazing.
And she, started this project, and she's well-known plus size model, beautiful inside and out human, and one of our early models when we were doing 67% projects. So I think she started to see the sea change
Mhm.
within the industry. And so that was something that was really amazing to be part of and create the video around, because I think it was very interesting to be able to hear from them directly, right? It's like, yes, photography is powerful, but also like having that voiceover video is really really special. Um, and then I think like some projects just taught me like what I was like showed me what I was made of from a creative
Mhm.
perspective. And I think
Can I interject real quick for a
yeah,
second?
yeah.
Because one thing I've noticed, and again, from the time of not knowing you in New York and that, all of your projects have had amazing production value and intent, and I think
Thank you.
that's kind of something that like where you can see that. So I wanted to touch and add that to it because it's just something where like you obviously have a very focused intent on what you're getting across. And I love that through the imagery that you've been part of.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, attaching, I think it probably comes from like my art background, which is like, attaching meaning around work and trying to like have it speak to whether it's projects that an actor is working on, or whatever the tentpole moment would be, like say a refinery. And then in terms of production, like someone who's been with me for a long time, which is Hen's Tooth Production. It's Mary Clancy Pace owns it, but we met actually at Maxim. She was a senior photo editor of mine and has developed a really amazing business, like one of the best production companies out there. And she now does all of her production at Facebook. So there's key people that I've like pulled in from my
Mhm.
previous lives that are like really now I'm able to like really fully hire like the dream team of people I've always wanted to like kind of assemble.
Back to the Voltron reference.
Exactly.
No, one of the things I really loved is just looking at your website was seeing the Evan Rachel Wood
Yeah.
photo shoot. Like it was amazing. Like it was done so well, and just it was just an excellent piece of imagery, and like you could just fall in love with each one of the photos, and like the set was just like it said something to you. It gave you a feeling inside when you look at those photos.
Do you know the story behind that?
I watched the podcast that you did. I can't
Okay.
remember. So I heard a little bit, but like even like making lemonade out of lemons,
Right.
right? Like,
And I think that is that's a lesson for young creatives, is that like, it's all cool if it's going well, but if it goes south, what's your plan? Right. And that's when you learn how, like, again, like what you're made of as a creative is like when you have to hard pivot, like how do you tackle that? Because again, I think it's really easy when it's easy, but when it's hard, it certainly can be challenging.
I think maybe just for people, so because they actually may not know on the show, if you want to give a little background
Yeah,
on that,
yeah.
so you can
The
kind of.
backstory is that we were meant to photograph Evan Rachel Wood, and the day before she had actually been testifying in Congress around abuse. And we had this whole shoot that was like in the San Diego-ish area, if I'm remembering this correctly. And it was an abandoned army barracks. So I had all of these like idyllic houses and very like cookie cutter vibe. And she was going to be this like strong persona within it. We're going to photograph her actually live. And what happened was that, rightfully so, she was exhausted. She could not fathom coming to set and doing it, which I totally respect and understand. And so I sat in the trailer and I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? There was no one around me. And I was like, I just had this idea, which is we're going to photograph the set and then shoot her later and project the images onto her. And so, and conceptually it worked because it was like projecting the American persona onto this person who's been through so much, right? And so I was with my senior photo editor at the time and my talent wrangler. And so we set up the photographer to be able to like photograph all of these spaces, to be able to, interject them later. And then, so I left the photographer and senior photo editor at the time to deal with that. And then me and the talent wrangler went to go and sell it up to her people in LA. So we traveled that day to be like, okay, we've got this other idea. We still want to make this work. Here's our idea. And, I remember the publicist on Evan's side, when we got to the place where we were actually photographing her later, which is, they were like, this is probably better than it would have been. And she's right. I do think it was better. And so that's a cool moment to be like, oh, actually, like that like root creativity is still part of us, right? We're still able to figure things out when things get tough.
No, and I mean, I get that. The story that goes along with it, again, you guys have to check out the photos. We'll link in the stories here or something like that. But it's an amazing piece. And I was wrapping up because I know you got to go. My last question was, what advice would you give to your younger self? And just as a person who is raising, you're raising part of a family like that, like, what are the things that you're teaching as a mother in this current age that, you're trying to pass on and exude to your child?
I mean, I think it's all the things that that we've kind of talked about, which is like, try and put yourself in the backseat, try to listen to other perspective, be exposed to different things, be curious, develop the interest and the need to be able to learn from other people, which will really, when I speak to Jack about this all the time, that's, what I'm kind of always preaching towards. And I think that's the same thing with my younger self, is like, remain curious, don't let that go, continuously develop it, and it'll really only serve you in the future.
Well, and others too.
Yeah, and others. Yeah.
Well, like that's an important thing to kind of think about, is just like, holistic kind of view. And again, it's so great to finally meet you and like talk and just kind of like be able to have this conversation, because I've been wanting to for years. And again, like finally tracked you down. Like it was amazing. It took a second. It was like bounty hunter. But thanks so much for taking the time to talk, Toby. I really appreciate your perspective and just like the work you've done. It's like it's phenomenal. It's very inspiring. Like it was it uplifted me being able to do research on you and find about stuff, and like now it's giving me all these ideas. So with that, I'm gonna go get back to work.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for today, and you have a great day. Okay, bye. If you enjoy the Social Studies show, please hit like and subscribe. If you found the information in the program relevant and insightful, copy the link, share it with your friends. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. These small gestures help increase the awareness and growth of our show. Thank you.